And let me begin by saying welcome to everybody for what I think you're going to find to be an absolutely fascinating program. This is the first in our series entitled Unlimited Mind. And when I had the idea, Richard Iardella was the first person I thought of because I had worked with Richard at the Monroe Institute and knew him to be a wonderful remote viewer with terrific brainwaves. And now he has segued into psychic detective work. And of course, for us, the awakened mind pattern is the pattern of the psychic and the healer and the highly advanced person. So it makes beautiful sense to share with you Richard's story. He'll share that with you. And then we'll look at a short PowerPoint show showing some of his brainwave patterns and experiences that will make, I think, very impressive sense of his evolution, brainwave-wise and consciousness-wise, since we first met in December of 2017. So, Richard, hello.
Hello.
And welcome.
Thank you.
You're there at your home in Wilmington, Delaware?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. So can we just start by asking you to tell us something about your background? Maybe anything that has to do with your gradual, I'm sure it must have been, realizations of psychic awareness, and especially as that began ultimately to apply to your police detective work.
Sure. So throughout my life, I've had several incidents that were, I would say, were bizarre. They had to fall into like the paranormal realm, but they were things that I never forgot about, but I never really delved into it, and never looked for an answer as to why these things happened. And I never discussed them with anybody. As I look back now, I think that was a little bit strange because my mother was always psychic. And as kids, if my mother had one of her feelings, everybody paid attention to what those feelings were. And, if we were involved in those feelings, because, we were concerned it might not be good. But at any rate, I never forgot these things. And I went on the police department in 1984. Very quickly, I went into detectives. And around 1990, I remember getting ready to go in for 3 to 11 detective shift. And there was a television show on, and they were talking about the government's secret psychic program. And, it caught my ear. And as I was getting ready to walk out the door, and I started listening to it, and they were talking about, how they were utilizing these psychic investigators for, the Cold War, applications in the Cold War. And I immediately thought, I wonder what the applications would be for law enforcement. But, I've got to go off to work. It was something that, like a seed planted in my mind. We didn't have the internet at that point. I was extremely busy with 35 and 40 cases, at a minimum. So it was just something that kind of was in the back of my mind. It wasn't until I retired that I happened to see another television show where it was more in detail because there was more information about remote viewing. And I thought, I remember that incident of me walking out and, thinking still about, even though I was out of law enforcement, still thinking about the application of that in criminal investigations. Now we have the internet. I started doing some, preliminary background, searches on the internet, looking for, who these guys were, how did they train, and so on and so forth. And in a lot of that, the Monroe Institute kept coming up. And I started researching the Monroe Institute and was interested in attending one of their programs. But at the time, to be honest with you, I wasn't sure like what it was. I wasn't sure if it was like some type of cult thing I really didn't have any idea. And I remember thinking that, you stay there for, the 6 days. There was a cost involved in it. And I just really couldn't, pull the trigger, so to speak, to make the decision to go. And ironically, I ended up going out to dinner with a former partner of mine who left the department and went with the Drug Enforcement Agency. And he wanted to introduce me to a girlfriend of his. And in the middle of this dinner conversation, she brings up the Monroe Institute. She was a very successful businesswoman in Washington, D.C. I was very impressed with her. And I thought, this is going to be the catalyst to get me to go. So I did. I took the Gateway program, and I had what I would say is a pretty profound experience there. So that really started opening my mind to like what the possibilities were with looking into consciousness. Also rekindled that strong interest in remote viewing. So that's actually how it got started. That very quickly after that, your program came out, and still intrigued by this. Now rethinking these past events that happened throughout my life that had some type of paranormal, element to them. This was really intriguing to me. And your program with Discovery, because of the science behind it, I wanted to dig in a little deeper other than just the experience that I was having, because how do you show that experience, right? So my experience to me is very personal. But how do I share the intensity of that with you? And your program allowed that to happen, because now you actually see what your brain is doing when you're in these states of like altered consciousness. And so that was the very beginning of it. So it just opened my mind to a lot of different possibilities. I did very well in your program. There were 8 targets that we had, and I had never remote viewed before. And in fact, we did like a practice remote viewing just to get ready for your program. And I remember sitting there at Monroe in the white carpet room thinking, Bob's assignment was, we want you to go up to your check unit, put your headphones on, and we want you to describe what's sitting on the desk to the left of the control panel. And I was thinking, I don't even know if I've ever been in the control room. So like, how could I even, like, I'm thinking this is ridiculous. The possibilities are in the millions. And as I was sitting there, I had this flash in my head of this like stuffed animal. And to me, it kind of resembled a rabbit. And, Bob dismissed us. We went up into the check unit, and I could not shake this vision of this rabbit with these kind of like funny ears to it. And it had a vest on. And when we came back downstairs and, Bob said, did anybody want to share? Everybody was a little reluctant because, it's your first time remote viewing. And to kind of break the ice, I said, yeah, I, came up with this, and I described what it was. And without missing a beat, Bob just looked to the next person. There was no indication in his face as to what had happened and what the target was. And after several people spoke, he brought out this stuffed animal. It was a Yoda. It wasn't a rabbit. And it had a vest on,
But big ears.
Yeah. And it kind of blew me away, and I thought, wait a minute, there's something really to this. So then the next day we do there were a series of programs. I think we did like 2 remote viewings a day. And by the second or third day, I just knew that, and we weren't getting the results until the end of the program. And I knew that there was no way that I had missed these targets. I mean, I knew that I was describing them. And the funny thing was, I was describing them like I had these impressions before we really did the meditation. I mean, I started making my notes And Robin, who was monitoring my brain waves, noticed that I was getting the impressions before we ever started. So all I needed was a target number, and I was getting it. So with the success of that, I then went back and took Joe McMonagle's remote viewing 1 and then remote viewing 2. And I struggled a little bit. I still had target contact, but I wasn't doing quite as well. And I had learned from Joe that there is a, kind of like a beginner's luck when you start doing remote viewing, right? So it's like once the ego gets involved,
right, wants to get it.
Right. And there's a battle between the ego and your subconscious. So I had to work through that. And what I did was we had a practice group that we, get together with Monroe people every Saturday and Sunday night, just do a real quick 15-minute target. And I wanted, even though I was doing well, I wanted more detailed information, and I wasn't sure how to get that. So that's when I started training with Pam Coronado, and instead of doing like extended remote viewing, which is really what Joe teaches, she teaches controlled remote viewing. And she also does some extended remote viewing, so you have that flexibility. But CRV gave me the foundation to kind of build on. So I've been with Pam for 3 years, and I've progressed to not only producing like 15 and 20 pages of information, but now working on, operational cases. So it's just mind baffling to me, and particularly with the operational cases, because when you produce that much information and once you get your feedback, it's you have to say to yourself that you cannot deny that there's some type of psychic functioning taking place here, because there's no way you can come up with detailed information, some of which was never released to the public. It's only getting that feedback from investigators that that you're completely on target. So
yeah, and so as I learned at the IRVA, International Remote Viewing Association conference, Pam Coronado is a leading psychic detective who has her own television show. What do you know the name of that show?
I think the name of the show was The Psychic Detective, and they had different psychics that were part of that show. But the thing that was interesting about that was this particular series, they were very dialed in on like the science aspect of it, like testing her. It was exactly, there were no hints, there were no additional information, there was no like front loading about a target. I mean, they were very strict on it. And they randomly would have her do tests and things off camera just to make sure that this was legitimate. Pam's been tested by the FBI. She's done work for them. She's done work for a whole host of police departments. So, she's well known within the field. So,
but even though you didn't have the term remote viewing, and probably wouldn't have believed in the psychic if it had come and done a dance in front of you while a police detective, you did have some experiences as a police detective. Tell us about those.
I did. I knew that I had an ability to find people, and I don't mean in the sense of someone who's been missing for a period of time, although through remote viewing, I've been able to do that. What I was able to do was find people who committed a crime within like 15 minutes of that crime, right? So by the time we get to the scene, they've already fled, but being able to track them was something that I was able to do. And I thought that it was just kind of like reading the streets, thinking like, okay, if I did this, what would I do? how would I make my exit? What were the things that I would do if I had committed this particular crime? And I just thought it was, good, being a good street cop. But after being, at the Monroe Institute, and particularly in your two programs, Superconscious Mind and Discovery, I started to say, well, maybe you weren't as good as you thought you were as as a detective, that maybe, there was some additional things going on there that kind of helped me.
Yeah, you tell me briefly about an experience where you were able to know when someone was about to pull a knife or a gun or something. That
No, what I told you a story about. I did a lot of undercover work. After I left regular detectives, I became a task force officer, which meant I was a deputized U.S. Marshal, and then I got farmed out to FBI and DEA and ATF for really most of my career. And I was doing an undercover deal, and it was a long case. It lasted several months, and we were buying drugs and guns off this particular group, and we were wrapping the case up. There was one last individual that we needed to deal with, and that would then, we were going to execute search warrants and execute the arrest warrants. And what happened was, even though that we've dealt with these guys for, the past 3 months, for whatever reason, this individual decided that he wanted to rob us. And I was with another guy who I left outside of the building, and I went into this like apartment complex with him to do this transaction. So instead of doing a transaction, he pulls out a gun and he puts it to my chest. And it was just a natural reaction. I just swept the gun away. And when I did that, he put the gun to my head. So as this is happening, what I've learned about myself is, and I've been involved in several, what they call like deadly force encounters or critical incidents, right? And that's what this falls under. I noticed that time seemed to slow down for me. So I would run various scenarios through my head, and I could actually see it. And I mean, some of the things were so, out there that it would be like, I would see the newspaper heading, how the local newspaper was going to cover this shooting. I would think about how my wife and my children were going to deal with my death. I'd run through all these different scenarios, but there will also be like tactical scenarios that are all happening within these split seconds. So there were two things that really bothered me about this. One was something about that gun bothered me, and I thought perhaps it's not a real gun. I was thinking maybe it was a starter pistol, which is a blank, it's a blank gun. It just shoots blanks. They're used for like, swim meets and races and things of that nature. But there was also, in the background, I could hear a children's cartoon. And it was like in my mind, I could see through the walls that there was no insulation. Now, was there insulation in that wall? I have no idea. But as I'm processing this, I'm thinking that this was a low-income housing area. I wouldn't imagine that they would put, insulation in an interior wall. I couldn't pick up where that child was. And I knew that the round that I was carrying would probably penetrate the individual, but also that drywall. And my fear was going into another apartment. But the main thing was really that gun. I kept thinking there's something about this gun, and I didn't think it was real. So the end result is I was wearing a wire, so the backup team knew what was happening. And I knew that it would just be a few minutes before they came in. I mean, literally like, a minute and a half or 2 minutes before everybody got there. And once that happened, I was able to take this guy into custody. When they came through the door, it was a distraction, took him into custody. And my wife was a ATF agent, and she worked on his task force, with us. In fact, she was the supervisor. And I said to her immediately, I think this is a starter pistol. And she's a firearms expert and testifies in court as so. And immediately picked it up and said, no, it's a real weapon, but it was unloaded. So, those are things that really would have had an impact, I know personally, on me. Like, would I have been justified? Absolutely. But it would have bothered me. You know what I mean? And particularly, I didn't want to take that chance of that child being somewhere watching that cartoon. So,
heart-stopping moments. I bet you had a lot in that career of yours with so many different task force, all related to the potential for tremendous violence.
right. And there were times where, where we would do things, and some of the people that we were dealing with were like criminal organizations that were very well at what they did. And a lot of times those guys would pat me down. So I did not want to take a gun with me. So on some occasions, I would literally get to the back of my my government car. It was an undercover car. And I would make a determination like, okay, what am I going to need for this undercover buy? And sometimes I'd put the gun and, always put the handcuffs and things like that in the trunk of the car. And the incident that I spoke to you just about, I did that very same thing. That was my routine, where I went to the trunk and I was getting ready to throw the pistol into the trunk of the car. And I thought, I better hold on to this. So I got rid of like my identification, my badge, my handcuffs, but I brought the gun. And so there were a lot of things like that I have kind of rethought throughout my career, that there was some type of slight kind of guidance that was taking place.
Yeah. Why do you think you were such a popular investigator?
Well, I think because I was a hard worker, and I brought in some pretty big cases. So, and when you do that, then you have a lot of different agencies that are participating in these task force kind of operations, and they all want you. So there was at one point where I had 3 different federal agencies going to the chief of police, trying to get me to be detailed to their agency. And in fact, I actually had a U.S. Attorney's Office for Philadelphia try to negotiate a deal with my chief to get me to go to Philadelphia to work for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Philadelphia for a period of time.
So you say it's hard work. What kinds of skills do you need to do that kind of work?
Well, I mean, we're talking about a wide variety of skill sets here. So being a detective is different, and I'm talking about a suit and tie detective, where I was investigating homicides, robberies, shootings, things of that nature. But then there's also a different skill set for people that are working in plain clothes, doing drug work and undercover work. But I think that you have to be able to, connect with witnesses, families, and even your targets. If you're working in an undercover capacity, you have to be able to connect with them on a personal level, right? So, and it's not something you do in one setting, but it happens over various meetings. And I was successful with doing that. And then the other thing was being a good interviewer, right? Because when I went to the feds, I ended up having a very high confession rate. So I would do interviews where after about an hour and a half, they would end up saying, okay, this is what really happened, and this is what I did, kind of thing. So, which makes it a lot easier for when you're going to court. So,
one thing that I know as a journalist is that when you are interviewing someone, that you establish a relationship with them, and empathy comes into play. Not necessarily sympathy, but empathy. And there's a lot of psychic communication happening on the unconscious level while
Right.
that occurs. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you ever like feel like you knew just where to go with somebody to reach them?
I would, and I would, there were things that I would pick up during the course of our conversation that I knew that this was going to provide the in for me to either make that kind of personal contact or to give them a sense of like my legitimacy, right? So, and once you have that, then, in most cases, they're willing to tell you what you're looking for. So, in a lot of times, we were looking for additional evidence, other participants in the crime, things of that nature.
That's pretty amazing. Because that alone, that sort of intuitive connection is precisely what one would pivot to for remote viewing.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of it's an open mind. I mean, it's a directed open mind, but an open mind nonetheless.
Right. Yeah. Now for anything in that realm, remote viewing is kind of like my fallback, right? That's my foundation. So every now and then, Pam Coronado will have these different courses on various, psychic. I can't think of what she did psychokinesis was one, right? And so not that I thought that, that's something I wanted to do. I was interested in it and I wanted to see how it was done. So when I did that, what she did was everybody that was in the class, she mailed different objects to people and then, explained how you go about doing it. Well, for me, I just kind of remote viewed it. And, I hit both of my targets again. So it was really interesting. So I think that there are people that have these skills, right? These talents, and they may approach each different type of psychic functioning differently. For me, it's just remote viewing, and that's how it works for me. So I've had to figure out like my process, and I think that's where the training comes in. That gives you that foundation. So
Yes, and this seems like a good point for me to go through this slideshow because you did a lot of refining in that program, that first discovery program. So, and then as I cover this, Richard, just feel free to add any comments. So I've titled this, you, of course, and this being about brainwave evolution through TM meditation. You had been practicing TM for a few years. And when did you start that? And tell a little bit about that.
well, I started TM, I think around like 2012. And the reason for that was actually, it would have been 2013 because I ended up going back to the city. The mayor at the time asked me to come back to oversee the department's violence reduction strategies. And I reported directly to him. The politics of those type positions are extremely stressful. So what I wanted to do was to kind of quiet the chatter in my brain. I wasn't able to turn it off at night. And I remember reading something, many, many years ago about TM and looked into it and then took the course. And it was beneficial. And then ironically, I find out from Monroe that they recommend, meditation for remote viewing. So it's something that just carried through. So
it just makes perfect sense because I failed to say it at the ARVA conference, but essentially remote viewing is a form of meditation. I mean, you're becoming open and receptive with a quiet, focused mind. And so TM or any other sort of meditation practice would be a terrific foundation. And then the discovery program certainly caused some evolution, which we'll see in a few moments. RV practice is that you have been practicing with online groups and taking courses, but you've also been listening to Monroe Sound Science recordings. Would that
Yes,
be HemiSync or the SAM
it's
recordings?
both. It's
Okay.
both. And I use that a lot for my cool down before I start my RV. If I'm doing an extended remote viewing, I may use that a little longer to kind of get that process started.
Can I just ask you to explain what is extended remote viewing?
Extended remote viewing is basically what we're doing in your program, right? So, controlled remote viewing, there's a like a format that you follow, right? There's different stages, and you follow that stage. So it would be
Like
like
what? Give an
an
example.
example would be um, they use an ideogram, which is just like a scribble on a page, right? And the theory is, and this style was developed by Ingo Swann, and the theory is that in that scribble that you make, you write your target number, and then you just make a mark on the page, whatever your hand does. So the thought is that, and Joe McMonagle says this all the time, as soon as you get the target number, you already know what the target is. You just haven't brought it, you know, up to your conscious mind. So you look at what I do is I look at my ideogram and I break it down into 6 sections, and I will run my pen across it or my fingers across it, and whatever the feeling is that I get from that, I'll start listing what the gestalts are, and I'll start listing like what the textures are with that gestalt. So
Huh.
they call that like the A-B process. So, the A would be the gestalt, the B would be what is the texture. And you want to get at least 6 of those before you move on to the next stage, right? And then the next stage is you're breaking down the in a finer detail those textures, and now you're looking for also for colors and things of that nature. So now you're building that gestalt, and then you move to another stage where you actually start doing drawings, and then you get to like a summary, and you know it's really an interesting process, but it takes time. I mean, so for me to generate 15 or 20 pages, it takes me like 3.5, sometimes 4 hours to get that much detail.
Well, I definitely want to talk to you when we finish this PowerPoint show much more about exactly those processes, and hope to give some insight into those processes. So we, with the Institute for the Awakened Mind, the Mind Mirror monitors, who began to take the Mind Mirror to monitor people experiencing a series of exercises, beginning with an opening baseline, and then a series of exercises, and ending with a closing baseline. So during this one program, there were 8 targets, and Richard was there. He was sitting at Robin Bernard's table, and she did a really beautiful, we're going to see it, report on him. In subsequent programs, I stole him away from her, I freely admit, with absolutely no regret. She forgives me. And most of these patterns are from Robin's report. So 8 remote viewing targets. At that time, those targets, while people were hooked up to the mind mirror, were located as an object or a representation of an object placed inside a wooden box that was set on the rafter in the training room, big room where there would be 12, 16, 20 people, depending on how many participants. So Richard sometimes got the target the night before, sometimes, as he said at the beginning, but still, Robin went through and snipped some interesting patterns. So this is Let It Be, target score 1, liquid mind, target score 1, meaning a perfectly accurate description of the target. Same thing, he hit the target 6 times with a target score 1, a target score 2 one time, a 4 another time. But that was really extraordinary. I mean, no one else in the seminar did that. And as far as I know, nobody else has. There have been some people who have gotten as many as 3 and 4 of, say, 8 targets, but never 6. And so you can see these patterns. He's got very high awakened mind scores, not only on training level 5, which means 50% pattern attainment for the exact shape of the awakened mind pattern, but also training level 4. This is among the highest scores I've ever seen for training level 4. High awakened mind at 31%, high gamma synchrony at 46%. Anything above 30 for gamma synchrony is considered significant. Same 30 demarcation point for the evolved mind. But then, so this is the whole session. This is an average of the whole session. So then Robin snipped this exercise was an OBE, but Richard didn't go out of body. He was focused on getting the target. High awakened mind, gamma synchrony 90%. But notice, and I'll show you more about this, his very highly extended delta. In spindrift, he has a ton of gamma, 94% on the 100 hertz scale, an absolutely stunning gamma synchrony pattern, which is, most of you know, is the superconscious pattern where people are producing these high frequencies that are associated with mental lucidity, integration and learning, attentional focus, but also psi experiences. Here's a snip of Secret Island, and look at the gamma. He blasted into the gamma and almost with an evolved mind top. Also a target score 1. This was a target score 2, but you can see this highly amplified pattern with almost an evolved mind. And then this summary pattern for another target score 1 hit. Gamma synchrony 79, awakened mind 89%. So this was very interesting, and it just gets more interesting. So in that program, I pulled out of Robin's report his opening baseline, meaning that he sits down in the chair for the first time and we go through an eyes open segment, 3 minutes, an eyes closed segment, 3 minutes, and do an animal meditation. Well, that day, Richard reported having a headache that was nearing migraine level. So you can see that he had some pretty low amplitudes that were unlike his subsequent patterns. But even with that low amplitude, with his eyes closed, a whopping 98%. So, you know, this goes back to what we've been talking about thus far here about this psychic ability. Again, this is the brainwave pattern of the psychic. You know, Richard's ability to focus his awareness and be calm and allow things to come in through whatever brainwave category they decided to come into has developed his 98% awakened mind. That and the TM. Yeah, by then you were doing TM for about 4 years. So yeah, that's a phenomenal score. Very few people get up there with that 98%. But in this program, not a lot of gamma. He's closed his eyes 25%, but during the animal meditation, which lasts about 12 minutes, he focused his awareness on getting answers, and his gamma extended up to 52%. That's not showing in this pattern, but that means that there were high frequencies above these two. So, and I also pulled his alpha theta ratios. So, meaning 2 parts alpha to 1.6 parts theta, which somebody pointed out the other day, relates that 1.6 to the golden mean, subject for another day, but nevertheless, 77%, well above the 75 we would expect to see in advanced meditators, psychics, healers, mediums, and other highly developed and spiritually aware people. But then when he's focusing, that alpha theta level goes to 83%. So this is really a tip-off that when he focuses, it's more than just hemispheric balance, which you see in all of these patterns here. It has to do with his ability to dive down into these quiet, still waters of the subconscious mind to derive information. So Robin captured these three here, all of these actually, in the exercise titled Let It Be, where he had a target score 1. He starts to seek the information. At the 20-minute point, he reported after the exercise that this was the period during which he started to seek it. And look at the blast up into gamma. So here is that focusing ability, that sustaining awareness. But notice also this big blast of delta down here. So what Robin concluded from looking at this pattern and others like it was that he was hitting the target in a combination of a sudden blast of gamma and expansion in delta as well. You see, she's calling it a low gamma spike by 33 minutes, still the same delta is present. And what is that delta? But what we've been talking about is when you're communicating with someone else and expressing and experiencing empathy, there is a psychic link, and that psychic link is between you and the other person, or you and the field itself. So this is Richard making connection with the field, opening his mind in this gorgeous pattern, awakened mind, but with some gamma here. And then she caught another gamma spike right toward the end. And then in liquid mind, now you're seeing much more gamma. And indeed, as this program progressed, the gamma audio signals and the exercises were having a distinct and defined effect on Richard's brainwaves. I can't say, no one can say, that they helped him access the target, but what you can say is that gamma promotes coherence. If his brain were assimilating those gamma beats, then most certainly the result would be a distinct sense of peacefulness and a connection, a sense of connection with something greater than. It might be a feeling of subtle energy, or it just might be a feeling of pure awareness, which he did report in all these programs. So 83% gamma synchrony, but 90% awakened mind. So he is varying between these two patterns, alternating between them. Same thing in this pattern. See all this huge delta down here, 90% awakened mind and 90% gamma synchrony. And so Robin, for her report, did this lovely little spreadsheet here and did some averages. And just look at this training level 5. Other than eyes open when he had the headache, these very high scores for the awakened mind, all of them well above 70%, with an average of 91%. Evolved mind scores, not really much of a factor, except here 33 and 31 when he in 36, where he exceeds the 30% point of significance. And you have to have a dual hemisphere pattern to get an evolved mind reward, meaning a distinct movement toward a circle for that pattern of universal awareness. So he's got some of it, but it's not as much a factor as the gamma is, 79%, 81%. Not always, but a great deal of the time with an average of 64%. Still, his dominant pattern at that time was the awakened mind. And he still had that pattern during the Superconscious Mind program that I led a year later in December of 2018. That program was different from every other discovery program in offering verbally guided meditations with gamma audio signals in them. And the point of the program was to help people get a memory of when there was a shift in consciousness, which you could anchor to a meditation instruction. So the monitors are sitting there drawing people's patterns and writing notes about what was happening at a specific point in time, which they recorded next to each pattern. And so people were able, therefore, because of the verbal instructions, to be able to say to the monitor, oh, that happened while I was walking toward the wise one. And then the monitor looks at that pattern and says, oh, this was your pattern. And they say, oh, and then we see the pattern elsewhere and people learn to reproduce that pattern. It becomes what we call a landmark for them. So Richard's pattern had changed somewhat, but not a lot by the time of the Superconscious Mind program, except for one major thing, and is that with his eyes open, he had this very high awakened mind score of 82%. Now, as you know, when people open their eyes, for the most part, alpha can completely disappear, or at least move to very low frequencies, and people will typically go back into this kind of hourglass pattern of ordinary consciousness. Instead, Richard had externalized his awakened mind. He had somewhat of one in the first program, but a lot less alpha. So something happened in that ensuing year. And the alpha was steady and stable in this gorgeous pattern. But you can look at this and see that Gamma Synchrony was not a factor. Evolved mind, it liked him for that pattern because he's got all this amplitude in this awakened mind. So the software says, oh, that's moving toward a circle. Eyes closed, back to his same original a year earlier, 98% for the awakened mind. But again, Gamma Synchrony, not a factor. During the animal meditation, well, Gamma Synchrony increases a lot, but not up to the point that we think is substantial enough to be really something. And so I pulled these graphs here to kind of show the progression that he had during this program. So Richard, I have your permission to share your meditation experiences with you, and I thank you because patterns make a lot more sense when you understand what's causing them. So in the opening animal meditation, he was a polar bear on the hunt. He had initiative, he was capable, a stealth survivor, able to find what's needed to survive. But interesting, and in a beautiful awakened mind pattern, back to that 98% awakened mind. But an interesting thing happened during the eyes open segment. He saw a formless object shoot out of the wall. Do you remember that, Richard?
I do.
He told me later he thought it was a cat or something, but there was nothing in the room happening that we could detect. And then he goes into, there were lots of other meditations, but I've just chosen some high points. The timeline, and he experienced 3 past lives. One was flying in a P-142 in 1942. Do I have that right?
I yeah, the timing is right, the year. I don't remember I don't remember. I mean, I remember the airplane. I don't remember what type of plane it was, though.
Okay. It was some kind of airplane, and he was on business. And then he found himself in 1873 on a prairie, feeling the breeze and not wanting to repair a wagon wheel. So, in this, I should explain in this meditation, you rise up out of your body to a timeline. And how I wrote it was that there are three spheres, each of different colors, and you allow your awareness to move toward each of the three spheres consecutively, and then you look down from the timeline, and these are the visions that he found himself. Had you had any past life insights or anything before that, Richard?
As a child, somewhere between the age of 4 and 6, and I know the deadline of 6 because I was born in Baltimore and we moved to Delaware when I was 6 years old. So sometime in that like 4 to 6 period, I remember, and I've always thought about it, sitting in my backyard playing by myself, looking at the sky. It was a spring type day, nice breeze, sun was out. And I remember thinking that this time is going to be better. There, I I knew that it meant with my life, this lifetime, but there was no comparison as to what the previous one was, right? I didn't know better than what. There wasn't any type of thought about that. In your program, that came up again, and it was so vivid. It was as if I was sitting back there again on that little sidewalk, playing with these little army men, and having that thought again that this time things were going to be better. So, other than that, that's it. So,
Yeah, so no past life regressions or anything. So
no.
this must have been kind of startling when you had these super vivid experiences one after another.
Yeah, and the thing about the Christmas is one that I often think about because that was so real. Like the ornaments and things that were be associated with Christmas were so vivid. And I looked up later, and they were in that time frame.
Hmm.
So
Nothing like confirmation.
yeah,
And and the point of the exercise was to get not just past life. Well, actually, it didn't say anything about past life memories. You could be looking down at your present life. It's just that Richard went into past lives. But the point of it was to help people gain insights into patterns and it didn't say that during the verbal guidance, but that was the goal, was to look at patterns in their lives that might be repetitive so they can glean information. And Richard totally got that concept. He said there were times when his focus was on work efforts, either too much or too little, as in the wagon wheel. And he
right.
realized he needs balance in his life with work and family. Yeah. So you can tell that he has taken a deep dive here into the subconscious mind. And not only that, into the unconscious mind, which Delta has upturned to be transferring information up into those higher frequencies. Absolutely gorgeous pattern. And there's a dead on proof. This was not his thinking mind giving him information. This was his subconscious and his unconscious. And then we did a meditation called the Wise One. And he said later that the landscape for him changes from autumn to winter. And then you walk into an area and toward this wise one who's waiting for you next to a boulder. And so he sat down to the next one. And I think it was you who peeled the mushroom, not the wise one, but you, Richard.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. Peels the mushroom and his consciousness goes into it. And he hears a message. Don't be as giving of self. Focus on what you need to accomplish. Don't end up in the winter season of your life thinking about what you should have done.
Right.
So this is some pretty cool stuff, and especially the brainwave pattern for it. He moved into this, what we would call a diamond-shaped pattern of the higher self, at the specific time in the meditation that you are asked to merge with the wise one, or the wise one merges with you. And there's this pattern of the higher self. So in this meditation, I mean, I think that by now, in this program, everyone has grasped that Richard is a very practical, pragmatic person, whose introduction to the psychic happened later in life, and not even because of his own experiences as a homicide and police detective or investigator, but because he had an inner recognition when he saw those television shows that this was something for him to follow. So this is the brainwave pattern of a practical person. This is the brainwave pattern of someone who's realized that not only is something else going on, but I'm part of that something else. I am that something else. And indeed, later on in this same Wise One meditation, he had this beautiful evolved mind flare on the right, with an awakened mind and a partially evolved mind on the left with this circular bottom here. So there is, evolution within this program that we can definitely see. And one morning, Richard said, I saw a ghost last night. And I went, what? And he told me that, and then I asked him to tell the whole group that he had gone to bed and he woke up, and correct me if I have any details of this wrong. He woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning and opened his eyes, and a ghost came flying up to his check unit and said, hi.
Yes.
And you jumped out of the bed, right?
I told people it was like a paratrooper jumping out of an airplane. I couldn't get out of that check unit fast enough.
I certainly didn't go to bed expecting to see a ghost. And you ran downstairs, right?
Yeah, I stayed up for probably about 2 hours after that.
He ran downstairs looking for somebody to talk to, and of course, nobody was there. But what are you going to do after you see a ghost? But then the next morning, when he was telling it to me, he said, now I wish I had said, who are you? And tried to find out something about that ghost, So it may be that during this eyes open, where he saw this formless object shoot out of the wall, that this was just a sort of prescience that he was moving into the brainwave patterns where the veils absolutely dissolve, where you become that greater than, where you merge with it, and therefore your psychic powers become far more accessible and reproducible. And indeed, so then we had these two RV exercises, and in Infinite Mind, he had a target score 1. And higher, he had a lot of imagery, felt like he was falling out of his body at one point, and you can see the amplitude decrease. Just compare, this is all at 10 microvolts, 10 and 9 microvolts. And so look how the pattern has decreased there. So he was just about to fall out of his body, and he caught himself. But during that exercise, he saw Ross Dunseith, who is the co-director of research for the Monroe Institute, and also is a biomedical engineer for the Department of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, which is all studying psychic stuff. He saw Ross, if I remember correctly, you saw Ross walking toward you on the deck, just outside the dining room, smiling at something that he had expected and had been confirmed. Is
He,
that right?
yeah, what happened was I saw Ross coming towards me and smiling, and he stops me and says, "You are a remote viewer." And then what happened was after this exercise, we broke and we went to go to lunch, and I did in fact pass Ross. And I think he had a young girl with him. I don't remember that part, but he stopped me and said, "You hit the target. And whether you know it or not, you are a remote viewer."
He remote viewed. He's telling you that you are a remote viewer.
Yeah, I
Which
pretty
is,
confident. Yeah.
that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. So raw talent, and of course, um, Monroe is hosting these programs, Discovery Program, specifically to do studies on remote viewers. What are their brainwave changes? What is actually going on? And so they dump all the data into spreadsheets and um, like wonderful, perfect geeks, study it and study it. So to find a remote viewer as gifted as Richard was very exciting to Ross. And I think he invited you to go to the DOPS lab for
He
some
did.
studies over there.
Yes, he did. And we, because of my timing or his timing, we haven't been able to put that together.
I'm sure they will. Over at that lab, they're using 19 and 38 or whatever it is, channel EEGs. And so he wants to look more at what parts of your brain are doing this. What we can see is that in terms of having profound experiences and remote viewing the target, is that you're pretty much going all the way into all of our patterns. And so then I prepared this slide entitled it Evolution, um, just to show you how all those things Richard has been doing, the TM meditations, the remote viewing practice, the discovery programs, the hemisync, and also the SAM, spatial angle modulation, uh, audio signals with the gamma beats, has made for an extraordinary evolution in his brainwaves, and I'm sure consciousness too. So in this meditation, these two meditations, December 2017, we're looking basically, yes, we are looking at some gamma, but these are primarily very advanced awakened mind patterns, 94%, 91%, 49 and 66. So the gamma is averaging in when Richard goes to perceive the target. So that effort in the brain to shift states and attain what's invisible is producing the gamma, and the gamma's factoring in. But if you sit with him and eyes open, eyes closed baseline, he's mainly had an awakened mind pattern. Now, in February 2023, I was delighted to meet up with Richard again and had the pleasure of being his monitor, and was absolutely thrilled to see that in the opening baseline, with his eyes open, he had shifted from the awakened mind to an 88% gamma synchrony on the 100 hertz scale. So this is telling us something extremely important. First of all, that the things he's been doing cause this evolution in the brain mind consciousness, and that the shift with a super strong foundation in theta and delta up into a predominant gamma, high amplitude gamma. These are normally, think about that flat in everyone all the way down. So these would be considered high amplitude gamma, can be externalized. So this superconscious mind pattern of gamma synchrony on 100 hertz scale, he did externalize it. This is why he was the first person I thought of for the Unlimited Mind series. This is absolutely amazing. In ARIA, target score 1, same Gamma Synchrony pattern, 50% this time, 60% this time, but both target score 1s. Now, what's also important here is that I noted his mystical scale scores. So now we've got this pragmatic detective shifting into these psi experiences more and more as time goes on, at least in the discovery program. I'll ask you later if it's, I mean, it's all psi, isn't it? If it's remote viewing. But the mystical scale refers to a measurement that we use where is listed 10 factors. So one is a feeling of that it's not your ordinary experience. Another will be a feeling of awe or reverence. And there are a few little things like that that you can't describe the experience. But by the time you get up to mystical scale 5, well, now you're having a distinctly psychic experience and you're getting some insights. There's a flow of insight, or at least a feeling of something greater than. And here, mystical scale 7. So this is right smack up at the top of an awareness of universal consciousness. For Richard now, it's in the Gamma Synchrony. And of course, there are evolved mind flares too, because beautifully enough and blessedly enough for all of us, once you start producing and being able to maintain these gamma frequencies, it does stabilize and inform the lower state patterns, the lower frequency patterns of the awakened mind and evolved mind. So Richard and other people who are producing this extraordinary superconscious pattern, when they dive into low frequencies, then they're producing the same extraordinary patterns in low frequencies of the awakened mind and the evolved mind. So he's crossed over. Basically, you could call it transcendence. You could call it, one of the descriptors would be mystical union, spiritual ecstasy. I don't think those terms are what Richard would call it, but he certainly knows that something strange is happening, because in that same program, 3/4 of the way through the final exercise, light source, which he gave a mystical scale 10 to, which means encountering ultimate reality, Richard popped in somewhere and someone asked, "You went somewhere, didn't you?" He handed that someone a piece of paper with the address of where he'd been. Next, he floated through a purple and gray landscape and saw light beings, and I asked him later on to say more about that. And he said that they were tall and blue and did or didn't have discernible faces.
I mean, there were details to the face, but it wouldn't be like I could tell one from the other.
Uh-huh.
But what I could tell was that one was a superior, the other was a subordinate. So
Yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is I couldn't pick those two out of a photo lineup, right?
Right. But they were definitely blue and tall and
right.
lit. So they're standing around a table. One of them glanced at him and said, "Another hitchhiker. It's happening again." So meaning another hitchhiker, meaning that he has crossed into their dimension and has hitchhiked on his gamma, I think. And look at his pattern. It's this beautiful gamma synchrony pattern with an upturned delta that is movement. Well, it is the evolved mind. And so they, I don't know if they were bored with it or just, sort of indifferently expressing their reaction to it, whatever it was. Richard then noticed a unique brown device with a silver button in the middle. Then a large, shiny, silver metal object turned toward him, and electrical shocks twitched him back into waking awareness. You can see, look at his gamma. This is right when he encounters these beings. His gamma went from 0.4 to 1.1, so they more than doubled his gamma amplitudes while he was hitchhiking there. So there we are. If Max Cade and Anna Wise were here, they would be going, yes, this is exactly what we've seen and we hoped. I mean, they weren't looking at gamma frequencies, but the evolution of consciousness that we've seen in your brain waves is certainly enhanced, stimulated, and the result of the activities that you've been doing. And then there's been in tandem an expansion of consciousness for you, where you're able to cross into past lives, move into other dimensions, merge with the wise one and the diamond-shaped pattern of the higher self. And this is quite an expansion and evolution for somebody who didn't even know what psychic stuff was before, right? I mean, did it feel like an evolution to you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's like I'd said to you earlier. I mean, I'm definitely on a journey. I'm not sure where I'm going, but again, it made sense of some of the things that happened earlier in my life that I kind of ignored and didn't talk about. And I couldn't explain what these bizarre things were, or why they happened, but I've never forgotten them.
Right.
But now, because of what's happened with this, it's allowed me to really kind of reflect on those incidents. So
Yeah. What seems unreal is actually real.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm sure that other people have questions. I'd like to just start by asking one of my own. I noticed while I was rereading your reports to do this PowerPoint that that you realized during one exercise that the target, when it came in crystal clear and you had no doubt about it, that that was what you learned to depend on.
Yeah, I'm very visual. And for me, I don't think that there's a set like system for remote viewing. This is just my point of view, right? I think you have to learn your process. And that's where the practice and the training come in. And particularly when you get your feedback, because you can go back mentally, or at least I can go back mentally to kind of delve into what I was thinking about and why I took it one way or the other. So it's, and even Joe had said something to this, and that is that it's like, because I asked him, it's like learning a new language in a way, right? Because those images aren't going to be crystal clear. They're not going to be exact. So like the example I gave you about the rabbit versus Yoda, right? So it's like my subconscious is speaking a different language than my conscious mind. And my conscious mind has now got to make sense of the information that's being supplied. So for me, my process is because of the meditations, right, with Monroe, um, I know where these landmarks are in my head, and I can go to those spots because those areas are where I'm going to get the information from.
So you're saying you have a landmark for awakened mind, evolved mind, feeling expanded, that gamma synchrony pattern.
Yes. And so what the process for me, what happens is as I start to go to that place, my logical mind moves off to the side, right? And it's like I've put it on the bench because I'm going to need it at some point to kind of translate, right? And my subconscious mind kind of expands. That's now, is that what's actually happening? I don't know. That's how it feels to me. That's my process. That's how I can justify what's going on. So I need that logical mind once my subconscious has expanded. The logical mind is, and trying to make sense of this, has got to be able to kind of give some directions, right? Like, what's on the other side of that wall? Show me this target from 50 feet in the air, that type of thing. Because if I'm not making sense of what this target is, then I do need some help from that logical mind, but I don't want to bring him all the way in. It's off in a distance, kind of adding some support. So
It's fantastic.
but that's how it feels to me.
So tell us now about this psychic detective work. So you were retired, you got this guidance not to overdo things, to balance your work and family, and you had a restaurant too at one time, right? You were in the restaurant?
Before I went on in the police department, I had two restaurants. Yeah.
Italian, I assume.
No, they weren't. One was a seafood restaurant, and the other was kind of like maybe like a French Italian kind of. They referred to it back then as like continental dining, that type of thing.
I wonder if you just knew what people would like.
I don't know.
All right. So, nevertheless, at some point in the process of becoming a better remote viewer, you hook up with Pam Coronata, and as I understood it, you were working with cold cases to start with, and now you're moving toward working operationally with ongoing cases.
In some scenarios, yes.
So tell how that works, and maybe some interesting story or two.
Well, it's no different than doing our regular targets because we don't get there's no front loading, right? So it's not like you get a target and she'll say, this is a missing person or whatever. I mean, all we get is a target number. That's it. So it's the same process as I just described to you. So sometimes she will ask for information, like she will want a timeline, and I don't know what the timeline is. She does, and that's placed with her intention. And it could be a 20-year timeline regarding this target, or it could be a 2-hour timeline. We don't know. But we'll submit our work to her along with that timeline, and we have a deadline to get it in. And then we get the feedback of what the actual target was. So,
well, that's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? So she knows the details of the case,
right.
And she just sticks a number on it. And what do you think is happening?
It's all about intention. And I'll give you an example. So this is why practice and training is important, because, and the example I'll give you, it goes back to Monroe and your superconscious mind. The second target that I did was one where I thought it was going to be a blown session because, you told us what the meditation was called and what you wanted us to do. And Bob, who takes care of the music, would always give us the target number. In this particular incident, if you remember, he did not give us a target number, and we started the session. And I was sitting there listening to the meditation, thinking at any minute now he's going to say, we're going to have to start over. I didn't give you the target number. Well, after like 3 or 4 minutes, I just said, all right, my intention is going to be whatever this target is for this particular meditation. So after 30 or 40 minutes, however long that meditation was, and we turned in our session, Bob said, if you noticed, we did not give a target number because we wanted to show that remote viewing is not affected by time or space. So then he goes up, or you went up, I don't remember who it was, but somebody went up on the stage there, the platform, and they turned around a board and they picked somebody out of the group to go select the target. There were like 15 targets there. So I hit the target that hadn't been selected until after it was done. So for me, that was very profound because I don't know if it would have had the impact if I would have just witnessed it, but because I did it, now I knew I'm not ever impacted by time or space with remote viewing.
Wow.
So, and then that allowed me to go back to some of those critical incidents that I was involved in and kind of explore how I was able to kind of slow down time. But during those incidents, as I'm processing all these different, endings to the scenario, tactical responses as well, and then even obscure things like how the newspaper is going to cover this. I realized that I was functioning at like a frame or two faster than everybody else, right? So that was the piece that allowed me to get out of these situations without getting hurt. So, it's just fascinating. Like the time piece of this is just mind-boggling. So somehow I was able to slow that down, process it, but move faster than the threat.
So time is definitely not linear in your realization.
No, it's not. It's not. And I've listened to other people talk about time in very traumatic situations. And in some of those cases, people have said the same thing. It's almost as if they have controlled the time, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So when Pam gives you these target numbers, what kind of cases have they been? Can you say anything about them, especially since they're cold cases?
Like generically, I'll talk about them because, as you know, there's another aspect of remote viewing, and that is the integrity of what you're doing, right? It's the integrity of who the tasker is that's asking you to do the session, right? Because sometimes people don't have the best intentions, right? Like if somebody were to say their intention is for me to describe where the alarm systems are in a particular building,
Right. The next heist.
right. But then there's also a piece that, and I did an operational target that went to a pretty dark place. And so even though I had a really good session, it's not something that you would want to share with someone, right? Because not just because of the darkness of the session, but because there's a human being on the other side of this, right? I mean, there's a victim there. So I don't particularly feel comfortable talking about those kind of things.
Yeah.
Um, but, you know, again, that one incident, and that was early on in doing these operational targets, you know, you sit back and you say, how is this even possible? All I have is a target number.
Yeah.
And, you know, to make the sketches that I've made and then see, you know, like a poster of things that law enforcement is looking for that I drew, you know, that they're identical to what I drew. People said that as soon as they saw it, they knew exactly what it was. So,
Wow. And what about missing persons cases? This is applicable to that?
sure. Yeah, it's the same thing. It's so for me personally, I get like a feeling of I like describing a location of where that person is. Sometimes time is in this as well, right? Because I can describe things that happened before and after where this person is currently today, right? Um, and there's also a feeling of whether the person is alive, dead, or injured. So it's, you know, it's after you're doing one of these operational targets, I mean, you're drained. I am. I mean, it's, you know, because for me, the way that it works is I go to where that target is, right? And part of that foundation for CRV is not only describing how you feel at the target, but how other people feel at the target. So that would include, you know, the person who's missing, people that are in the area. It can include relatives. It can include if the person was abducted. You know, it's all of that. So there's a lot of emotional like baggage in doing these. So
Yeah, I can't even begin to imagine. But I'm glad that you are doing this because, as I understood it from Pam and other people at the IRVA conference, uh, that law enforcement is far more open today than they were in the past. I think she said that, or someone said, some speaker said that uh, every major city now relies on psychics and remote viewers. They may not admit it, but they do.
yeah, I think what they said was most police departments use psychics. They just don't admit it. And
Mm-hmm.
that was from Pam and also from Paul Smith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It seems a lot more efficient.
Well, you know, there's always information in these sessions that are possibly irrelevant, right? So there are things in there that you can't confirm. And then there will just be misinterpreted information. So it's not like, you know, it's 15 pages of every line is accurate information. It's not like that. Um, but most of it is, you know, like 80%, if you're on target, 80% of it is accurate.
So the lines of investigation could and should be in tandem with one another. Is that the remote viewer knows they're on the right track if the police say, yes, we've been looking in Winnipeg, Manitoba,
Yeah,
and the
it's
remote
actually
viewer said, yeah, that's where I got. So then they can galvanize
Right.
each other.
In some cases, you may not get any feedback, right? So you just submit your session and you don't get anything back. But it's you that knows whether you're on target or not based on the feedback you would get, right? So in my case, my feedback comes from Pam. So, and then, it's not only her, the information that she has, but it's whatever documentation that she's acquired regarding this particular case,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, of course, I always have 10 more questions on the trail of the previous one, but let me just open it up now to other people who are here. Do you have questions or comments that you'd like to make? If so, just unmute and ask away. Oksana, I bet you have a question.
I don't have a question, but I really would like to thank Richard for opening up, for finding time and sharing all of this, how I call it, the kitchen of our remote viewing or intuition or other psychic ability. It's always good to see how others see it. And with, my own experience and my own research and studies and everything, I can resonate with absolutely, every single word, how we communicate with our subconscious mind or unconscious mind, how the mind that we are used to so much has to sit on the bench and take a turn only to interpret what we receive. And we receive information in very exotic, symbolic way in another language, on another frequency that needs to be reinterpreted somehow and packaged in, I don't know, pictures, words, into something we are more used to, capable to relate and explain and pass it on to others. So I know it very well. So thank you so much. I don't know Monroe Institute programs that well, unfortunately. Maybe it's coming sometime in the future, but to me it was really exciting to see how you share, and I know it's real life experience. It's not something you were thinking. It's something you were really, I should say, it's an ability that we all can develop by tuning in, by having this, very good, relaxed focus, and just being attentive. It's really the quality of our attention, right? So that we can train where to direct attention, how to direct attention, and all the subtleties, right? So observation skills, all these little subtleties of textures, feelings, colors, all our senses in full mode, full volume, how I say. So thank you so much, Richard. It was a pleasure. Really, I enjoyed the program. Thank you, and thank you, Judith. Brilliant journalist skills. Great interview as usually, and
Curious
great work,
mind.
I assume, at Monroe Institute as well.
Yeah, it's fabulous opportunity for the mind mirror community, to be studying these expanded states of consciousness. Anybody else have a question before we sign off? Speak now.
It's more just of a comment. I mean, just this session just completely blew my mind of what we're possible with. So cool. Thank you very much for sharing all of this, Richard and Judith and Oksana.
Thank you for your comment.
I got to say, it blows my mind too. I mean, I just, sometimes when I get the feedback, I'm just blown away that, still, I mean, I've really been seriously remote viewing for the last 3 years. And even a month ago, I had one that just really kind of blew my mind. And like I said before, I think the key to this really is you have to put the time in. It's the practice, and it's the the training, and I'll continue to train with Pam, because there's little nuggets of information that you learn between the interaction of like the teacher and the student, right? That wouldn't go into the normal curriculum, but it's working through these sessions that you pick up those pieces. So, it's like there's things that Joe McMonagle has said that just resonated with me. And one of them was, he does his session, and once he puts his pen down, he's finished with it, whether he gets feedback or not. That's it. He can't do any more. It's done. That allowed me to kind of get over that. Like you said in the beginning, I had a lot of wins on the front end. So I started putting this pressure on myself of, all right, is this going to be the one that gets me? And then that starts taking you out of that mindset. And then it's the ego comes in and, plays with your head. So I took that one little sentence from Joe, and that's kind of been my mantra now. It's like, all I can do is my session. I can only give you what I get, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And if I'm off, I'm off. So,
well, taking the ego out of it is very much the key, isn't it? I mean, you saw in Richard's brainwave patterns that the ego is just not in there talking, and that going through the experience of getting past the ego's interference and getting it to cooperate has been really a development of your own superconscious mind. You're going to call on it when you need clarification. You activate it when you want a different viewpoint. And, how wonderful to be able to live in that witness consciousness, not the slave of the ego, but the ego and assistant to the superego. Fantastic. That is unlimited mind.
And I still feel that I'm at the very beginning of this, right? So I feel as though I haven't really learned how all of the implications to this, right? And how to kind of rein them in. So.
Well, come back once you've got it all understood, and we would love to hear what you found out.
That's what I'm working towards. Whether that happens or not is another story. So.
Well, we sure do appreciate your being here and sharing your time and your experiences and your brainwaves, and wish you the best of everything as you move forward with this operational psychic detective work, because goodness knows people's lives are at stake and fortunes, and it's really a service to humankind, which also is the definition of the superconscious mind, to provide that service as you have always through your life. Thank you for all of that, and thank you for being with us.
As I always tell you, whatever you want, whatever you need.
He does. Anything you want, Judith. I love it.
Yeah, I like your line at Irva. Yeah, I still haven't figured out what else I want.
Well, I think that's the human condition, isn't it? We just dance right through it. All right. Thank you again. And we'll see you next time, I hope.
Okay. My pleasure.
All right. Appreciate your being on this first and very interesting and useful installment of Unlimited Mind.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye for now. Bye-bye.